Hi, I'm Stephanie Hopkins, a youth parliamentarian from Adelaide. Today I would like to introduce Mr. David Davis, the founder and the creator of the Youth Parliament programs in Australia. So David, tell us about yourself.
I was born in Brisbane, 1928, so that makes me a lot of years. And my era was in the era of ice chests, where the local ice block man came and gave you a block of ice. You put it in your ice chest. Wood fires. We didn't have electricity or gas, nor did we have. The trains were coal-fired, so it was a pretty sooty ride that you had. Bits of soot everywhere, and we had what we called wirelesses. We call them radios today, and no TVs. And would you believe, after primary school, if you wanted to increase your education beyond that, you had to go into the one and only high school in Brisbane, and that was in the city of Brisbane. One high school. Now that's hard for young people to imagine, because there's a high school in every suburb these days, but there was only one. So that meant that not everybody went to further education. When I went to a number of jobs, but the one that I want to refer to was I was in charge of a department in a wholesale warehouse for watchmakers and jewellers, a wonderful job. And one of the workmates there told me about the YMCA, and I'd never heard of it, and I wondered what it was. And he said, well, why don't you come up and meet some of the fellows and in the clubs up there. And I saw, it took me a while, but anyhow, a couple of weeks afterwards we went up. We had a dinner in the cafeteria that the Y had, and they took me upstairs where I met the Triangle Club. Now the triangle is of course the emblem of the YMCA, Body, Mind and Spirit, and it was called the Triangle Club. And there was about 30 young people about my age. I was around about 22 then, and we had a guest speaker. Then we went down to the gym, and that was the environment I liked. And we played volleyball and basketball and did some gymnastics and to keep fit, and finished off in the heated pool. And then we went to the cafe and drank volumes of malted milk at the end of the night. Anyhow, one day I had to get my gym gear cleaned up by Mum in those days, and so I walked into the Y to get my gym gear out of my locker, and here was a whole bunch of YMCA young kids around about 10 or 12 running around the place, and they had white t-shirts on with the red triangle and white pants, and some of my triangle mates were with them. So I didn't know what they were doing there. I thought it was some sort of a special event, but in fact they were leaders of boys' clubs. In those days the YMCA was only for males, not for family or not for females. So here are all these youngsters, and they were being looked after by the Triangle members, and I asked one of them what they were doing, and they said, oh, well, we're YMCA leaders. Look, we're short. Would you like to come and take part? And I said, no, not really. I've got 2 brothers. That's enough for me. Anyhow, it took me about a month before they talked me into coming and having a look at what it was. And I did that, and I found, as you do in the YMCA, that I had a talent for working with people that I didn't know I had. The only people that I worked with mainly was my 2 brothers at that time, but I found that I could work with people, and I loved working with these youngsters. And one day, the General Secretary of the YMCA of Brisbane, Mr. Alex Simons, asked me into his office, and I thought, oh dear, what have I done? But anyhow, he said, look, I'd like to offer you a job. You've got potential. And and I was in a good job which had a good pay, and what he was offering me was considerably lower than I was going to earn. I was about to get married, so I had to discuss this with my wife, but it really appealed to me and it got me excited. Working for the YMCA, working with people, seemed to be something that I would like to do. So I gave it a lot of thought, and we decided that yes, we would give it a go. But that meant that he said it was conditional that I got a diploma of youth work. Now, the diploma of youth work came from a YMCA college which was in Melbourne. And the first thing that I had to do was to go back and get an adult matriculation. Remember, I told you the only high school was in Brisbane and I didn't go to it. So I had to get an adult matriculation. I did that. And finally I went to the Y College in Melbourne, and I got my diploma, very proudly walked up and received that some years after I attended the college. That led to a 45-year career in the YMCA, and that's a long time, but during that period I not only worked in Brisbane, but I started a YMCA in Mount Gambier. I resurrected one in Launceston. I went back to Melbourne, then back to Mount Gambier to a new YMCA that they had there, and then I was offered the job State Director of the YMCA of Victoria, and that's where I finished my career 45 years later.
How did you arrive at the initial concept of the program?
Youth Parliament really commenced in what is called a High Y Assembly. Now I better explain that. High Y is an abbreviation of High School YMCA, and the YMCAs in Australia had literally thousands of secondary school young people in their membership, and so that's where the term came. And every 2 or 3 years we would have what was called a High Y Assembly, where they'd get together and have a camp and have recreation programs and debates of not so much debates, but discussions about issues that affected them in their YMCAs and how they would like to have this involved and that involved. And I had heard about a program in the United States YMCAs called Youth in Government. Youth in Government was where they took over their Congress, which is the American terminology for Parliament. And I was keen to give debating bills a go in Australia, but so I asked, as I was on the National YMCA committee that was organising it, I suggested that we perhaps could have 1 or 2 bills debated, and I also knew that the upper house, that's the legislative council chamber in Brisbane, was never used. They did away with it many years ago, and I thought, well, this is an ideal situation if we could get the use of it. And with negotiations with the government, we were given permission. Pardon me. We were given permission to use it, and so I brought along some bills that you might like to look at. They were the first bills. They're different to what you do today in Youth Parliament and what we did originally in the first Youth Parliament we ran in Melbourne. They were different in the sense that the staff, because of the limitation of time, and these bills were only an adjunct to the program, the staff made up the bills, and all the youngsters had to do was to debate what was in front of them. But it was a very good success, and the youngsters liked it, and I thought, well, that's good, I'll lock that away in my mind for some future use. When I became State Director of Victoria, which I told you about, I was responsible for developing youth programs in that state for use in the YMCAs in Victoria. Now, Victoria has an enormous number of YMCAs. There were 50 when I was there, and there are now more. But I thought, how can I best do that to make sure that young people were expressing what they would like to do? And so I asked YMCAs to send youth representatives to a meeting at the national headquarters with me, and we would do this about every 6 weeks, and we would gather together our thoughts about what programs young people would like to have. And so those 30 young people engineered a lot of camps and conferences and sporting programs and did a wonderful job in Victoria. They were intelligent young people. And then I thought about a youth parliament. But you know, I was hesitant to bring it up. I thought, oh, the modern young person wouldn't be interested in politics. It would be, ho-ha, no, it wouldn't be interesting to them, and how wrong I was. I finally introduced the idea of a youth parliament, and there was a pregnant silence for a long time. And then all of a sudden one of the youngsters said, "What's a youth parliament?" And I said, "I don't know. We haven't run one. So when we run one, I'll tell you." And we had a talk about it. And I suggested to them the best way is to go over and see how the professionals do it, the politicians in the Parliament House. So we did that, and we landed there at question time. I'm not sure that that was the best time to see Parliament at work, because what we saw was politicians yelling at one another, and there was a gentleman up one end of the Parliament House banging with what seemed to be a hammer on his desk, trying to keep order. We watched it for over an hour, and then we went back to the national headquarters, talked about it, and thought, boy, we reckon we could do better than that. So that was the birth of the first youth parliament. Those 30 people decided that they would go ahead. Now, of course, going ahead meant, as I was the staff person coming up with these glorious ideas, they gave me the job of going over to Parliament House to see if we could use the house, because you can't just walk into the Parliament. And so I did that, and I got the President, that's the President of the Upper House, that's the Legislative Council, Chambers, and the Speaker of the Lower House, the Legislative Assembly, and their two key staff people, which was the Usher of the Black Rod and the Sergeant-at-Arms. And I had a meeting with those four. And after explaining what I had in mind and what the young people were suggesting, they started to warm to the idea, and they became extremely cooperative and helpful. And they said, yes, we'll let you have the Parliament House and all its facilities. We'll even throw in Hansard, which is the recording agency within Parliament. It records all that the parliamentarians say and the bills that they make that are passed, as well as the clerks of the House. Now, the clerks of the House are tremendously important. They know how Parliament works, and we needed them to show us how bills were made and how to present them and how to debate them in a parliamentary way in the Parliament House, and what the protocols were, what did the officers do and how did they go about doing it. That led us to realise that we needed to set up training courses. If we didn't train the youngsters before they came to the Parliament, they wouldn't know what to do. It also gave me a bit of a headache, because it meant that when we got them in there to the Parliament, I had to accommodate them. Now, I found that during the war, the Army had a campsite close to the city. It was called the Urban Camp, and it was now available to the community. So I booked it for a week, and we had 3 days in Parliament booked, 1 to try ourselves out, and 2 to actually do the bills. And I had to get them from Parliament, from the urban camp to Parliament. That meant organising buses. They had to be fed. They had to realise that they had to go to Parliament properly dressed. They couldn't go to Parliament in a t-shirt. They had to be, boys had to have suits on and girls had to have dresses, and they had to look the part. and we ran training courses for the ones that were lucky enough to come to the first Parliament. And then I notified all the YMCAs in Victoria what we were planning to do, and asking them would they like to be in the first Youth Parliament. 46 youngsters were selected. Now the Parliament Upper House, which is where we ran the first Parliament in the Legislative Council chambers, could only hold 39 politicians. So I asked if we could get a few more youngsters in, because they're not as big as adults, and they were secondary school students, about 17 or 18 years of age, and I packed 46 in, and that was the first Youth Parliament. And truly it was magnificent. The youngsters, they reacted very positively to the fact that they were in Parliament House. I had to stop them hearing too much to begin with, because they got very excited. They'd seen too many TV programs with politicians yelling at one another saying, "Here, here." So when we ironed out those sorts of things, we found that they got on very well, and they learned to debate, and they learned to put their bills together, and that we were able to run training programs to show those 46 youngsters who came to the first Youth Parliament how to present a bill, how to debate a bill, and how to dress properly and use all the protocols in the Parliament. That was the first Youth Parliament ever run in Australia. I should say that first Youth Parliament was held in September 1986.
David, how was the first program run?
Well, I've told you that we went to some trouble training youngsters to how to make bills, and this came from the clerks. They were so helpful and made sure that we knew how a bill was put together and how it should be introduced and how it should be debated. And now we set up these training programs, mainly conducted at that time at the because there was only 46 young people involved, so we figured that they could come into Melbourne from the outlying YMCAs, and they did that. And so we wanted to get it as close to how Parliament was run as we could. The Westminster system of government goes back centuries, and although it's been modernised to some extent, there's still protocol that you have to follow, and it stops you from jumping up at the wrong time and making an ass of yourself talking at the wrong time. So we wanted it to look exactly like a parliament, and those young people made it look like a parliament. Sure, it took them a little while to get going. They tended to be a bit shy to start off with, because they weren't used to debating in the Parliament House, and the Parliament House in itself can be a bit overwhelming. It's a huge building and a lovely building, and it tends to overwhelm you when you're in it, and especially with the big chair and all the other ornate parts of it. It looks very inspiring to look at. But the Speaker did his job. Although he was a very conservative man, he liked to wear a wig and a gown, and that made it look all the better. As far as youngsters were concerned, they thought, well, that's pretty cool, having him dressed like that. But also, the only difference from a real parliament to ours was that we introduced a fanfare. Once again, the YMCA staff person had to go out and find a fanfare in the record shop, and I found a very good one, and we played the fanfare to allow the young people to walk into the Parliament House, and it added a bit of theatre to the Parliament. It's pretty good. In the second year of running the Parliament, we started to face a little bit of a difficulty. YMCA's got to know about this program. Of course, youngsters got back and they heard about it, and they all wanted to take part in it. Now, with 50 YMCAs around Victoria at the time, if everybody put in a team, we would have too many people. So anyhow, it also meant that the upper house couldn't contain that many people. I was lucky to talk the president into having 46 in his house. I went to the lower house and to the speaker and said, would there be a possibility of running another parliament in your house? He agreed and gave me the same level of cooperation as the president did. And so here we were with a much bigger chamber. Now the upper house is really a house of review, and when bills are made in the real parliament and they are presented to the upper house, and they have a look at them and perhaps alter them and adjust them, and they send them back to the lower house, and if they agree with the changes, they eventually become bills. But in the lower house, we didn't want to do that. We wanted the room for two parliaments so that the young people could learn how a parliament worked. That was more important than learning how to review bills. So now we had over 200 people, 200 secondary school students, and I had an assistant staff person to help me to do this. That was a challenge. The urban camp couldn't hold 200 people, so I had to get a marquee and stretchers, and we put up this huge marquee and stretchers. It also put enormous pressure on the kitchen. We had to get an extra cook because they couldn't cope with the numbers that we had. But you know, we did all that, and I developed leadership potential in young people. I thought, well, I can't manage all of this on my own, nor can my assistant. So what I'll do is I picked out potential leaders amongst the youngsters that came to the youth parliament and that were at the camp. And I made them in charge of, say, recreation, in charge of the kitchen so that the tables would be set and the washing up done, in charge of the buses to get the youngsters dressed and on the bus and into the parliament, and the music played and all those sorts of things. Each of them had a young person in charge of it. So here we were developing a lot of leadership in young people by doing that. But I had to, because it was the only way I could manage 200 people.
What did you hope to achieve?
Well, look, obviously the first thing was how did a parliament work? It was a challenge just to do that. And I knew, but the youngsters, the first 46 didn't know until they came, that that's where laws are made. And that affects the community a great deal. That's where all the laws of the land are made. And we as citizens have to abide by them. So it was important that we knew that, and I hope that we would achieve that. How you're in the debates, your point of view was important, but if you wanted to get across to people, you had to do some work on it. You couldn't just stand up and put your point of view across without thinking about it. And of course that's what the debates were all about, and that's what the preparation of the bills were all about. They had to think about putting their bills together and what did they try to achieve, what did they want to achieve from the bills they put together. Finally, probably something that nobody realised at the time was the enduring friendships that came out of youth parliaments. Not only did young people get to know one another at the Parliament House, but also at the camp. And you know, even I am still in touch with some of the 30 young people that originally helped me on what we call a task force, and that task force were members who I used to help me run camps. They were wonderful youngsters, and of course as they grew older they grew more effective, and but the enduring friendships were an absolute marvellous part of a youth parliament. And do you know, some of the youngsters actually got married, and not at the youth parliament, but from the youth parliament, and they still are of course in touch with many of the friends that they made.
So what problems did you face?
Learning how to set out a bill was a problem originally, because it's done in a particular way. It's not like a bunch of notes that you have when you're having a debate at school. There is a first reading of a bill and a second reading of a bill and a final reading of a bill if you manage to get it through. So that had to be learned, and you couldn't just jump up and debate whenever you wanted to. You had to do it at a particular time and in order. And when the chairman, the president, asked you, not when you wanted to. So this was an orderly procedure that had to be followed, and it was just a problem getting to know how to do that. Training people became, when young people came from all around Victoria, Victoria's quite a big state, and I had to get 2 or 3 youngsters. It had to be done on a weekend. We'd get 2 or 3 youngsters from the task force, and I would drive out to Warrnambool or wherever it was and train the people over the weekend how to put bills together and how to debate properly and answer questions that they had, because they had a million questions about what a youth parliament was all about. And I was keen to make sure that they came to the parliament as well prepared as we could possibly make them. So even finding out what the Sergeant at Arms and the Black Rod did, and I don't know whether you are aware of it, but the table at which the Premier sits and the Leader of the Opposition opposite is a certain width. So in the olden days they used to fight with one another, and to stop them hitting one another they had to get a bigger table. So the table that is used in Parliament is wide enough so that people can't hit one another. And the Sergeant at Arms has what is called a mace, and a mace is a weapon that was used in the olden days by knights, and the president of the early parliaments was often attacked, so the sergeant had to protect him with this mace, and he would use it and jab people with it, and so on. And the usher of the Black Rod did the same. He had a black rod, and if you got too close to the staff person that he was looking after, he'd hit you with it. And then of course he had the royal party was never allowed. The king was never allowed into the upper house, so he had to summons the lower house to his parliament, the upper house. And to do that, the Black Rod would go and knock on the door with his rod and summons them, and he was the only one allowed to do that. And so they'd all traipse back to the upper house and conduct their parliament. These were all interesting problems that we faced and learned how to use to deal with, and that's some of the problems that we faced.
What did the first youth parliament look like?
This is a picture of the first youth parliament that was ever conducted, and you'll notice that there is a picture showing the young people on one side of the table and the other. That's opposition and the government in their proper places. There is a Premier and his deputy, a Leader of the Opposition and his deputy, or her deputy. Then there's the President, that's the man in the wig, and you'll notice that there is a youth governor, and he was selected, in this case, by the young people themselves, and they selected a young man to open up the Parliament and act as a youth governor. So all of that is very lifelike. Quite frankly, it was magnificent. I was so proud to see how well they looked, and of course they were all in their suits and dresses, and a better picture you wouldn't possibly want to see. Now, we did expand the Youth Parliament to schools, because remember, all of these youngsters came from secondary schools, so schools wanted to take part. Now, that was lovely, of course, but it also meant that we couldn't fit them all in, and we couldn't get the Parliament House at another time, so we only had it in September, so we could only run one. And so I literally had to put YMCAs and schools on a waiting list, and when their number came up, they were able to take part. And we went through all the training processes that I've talked about with each of the teams, and quite frankly, they came quite well trained and quite well prepared for Parliament. And when you come to think of it, in the time that we have been running Parliament, I think it's been 32 years, we have trained and held youth parliaments and involved thousands of young people, literally thousands. And that means that young people all around Australia have got to know how their parliament works, how their laws are made, and they participated in making some of them. And by that I mean we would invite the Minister for Youth to every state parliament, and they would be given the bills that were passed. And a lot of the parts of those bills, sometimes the bill in entirety, were put into real bills, because the parliamentarians realised that here was what young people are saying they want. And that was an important part of the Youth Parliament.
How did you first expand on the program?
That is a great story. How did we expand? Well, having been successful in Victoria, I thought, hey, if we can do it here, surely we can do it in every state, because every state had a youth parliament, had a parliament house, and why can't we have a youth parliament in every state? Now, that in itself was an good idea, but a lot of work, and I had to go to, first of all, to the YMCA in capital cities and convince the board of directors to put aside resources, money, camps, vehicles, staff, and everything else in order to run this program. Then I had to convince every state parliament house that to let us use their parliament. Now, I managed to do that in every state in the whole of Australia. I went first of all to Hobart, then to Adelaide, then to Perth, then to the Northern Territory, then to Brisbane, Sydney, and we of course had them going in Melbourne. So that's every state. The only one that I hadn't had the challenge of doing was a national youth parliament. And I thought, well, why can't we do it nationally? And another good idea, but another headache. Because when I went, they had just built this huge national parliament for Australia. And it was a lovely building, and I had to ask permission for us to use it. And they said, sorry, no, we cannot let anybody use this new building. And they took me around to what is called the Great Hall, which was a magnificently big hall, and I looked at it and I thought, no, that can never be made to look like a parliament. No matter what you did with it, it wouldn't look like a parliament. And as I was walking around, I suddenly the idea popped into my head, well, hang on, there's an old Parliament House that can't be being used because there's a new Parliament House now. So I asked, well, could we use the old Parliament House? Oh, yeah, well, they'd have a think about that, and they came back with the answer, yes, of course you can. Well, what a magnificent building it is. That's where Mr. Menzies and Mr. Chifley and everybody else used to debate their bills many years ago, but it's a magnificent building. And so we ran the first national youth parliament in that wonderful old Parliament House. Now, since then, we've run a number of them, and every 2 or 3 years we run a national youth parliament. And we've also run an Indigenous youth parliament, 2 of them that I'm aware of. And it's interesting to see what the state parliaments, the state youth parliaments, their bills, and the Indigenous bills. The Indigenous bills, of course, relate to problems that they see Indigenous people have, whereas the state parliament houses, as youth parliaments, usually have things that young people in their life are concerned about. So that's how we expanded it, and you know, as I've said, 32 years later, it's still going, and I think it's totally unstoppable. This, because young people love to debate and have their issues aired in, well, the ultimate in our law system in the land, our Parliament House, and I'm proud of the fact that so many young people now know how bills are made and how their laws are made, and that's, if they know that, that's how youth parliaments have been successful.
What are some of the changes you've seen in Youth Parliament?
I really haven't seen too many. When I went, the last youth parliament that I saw officially was the 25th youth parliament in Melbourne, and it seemed to me to be run very similarly to our first one. After all, there's a procedure in Parliament. You just can't mess with it too much. You can't change it around too much. But so the procedure and the protocol and the well-dressed young people, the dress is a bit different, but apart from that, the talk is pretty similar. The fun is the same, and I think that the present youth parliaments would have all the characteristics of youth development that the first one had. When I commenced the youth parliament many years ago, really it was a big risk, because if those 46 young people and the task group that was involved with them hadn't done a good job, we would not have any more youth parliaments, because it would have stopped. The parliamentary staff would say, oh well, this is a flop, it's not working. So I wanted to make sure it would work. And it meant taking a lot of risks. We had to risk a lot in things that we did, and I had to take the risk, would young people react effectively and properly, or would they mess around in Parliament and think it was a bit of a joke? Well, they never did. They reacted very, very well. I had the pleasure of working with magnificent young people, inspiring young people. I can't tell you how important it was to have the, well, important to me, to have the pleasure of working with such intelligent young people. And today I just wish I could get stuck into working with them a bit more, but age prevents me. But in any case, I wanted to put that in. I'm so pleased to work with young people. One of the young people, Ben Hubbard is his name, became the Chief of Staff to our first woman Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Now, I think that's an enormous achievement. he got all of his training, as it were, about Parliament in the Youth Parliament, and he made a career out of it. Now he's one of a number that have joined the staff of MPs, and what a great credit that is to the Youth Parliament. And I think that if I can say I'm leaving a bit of a legacy, the Youth Parliament is it.